In this video we're going to learn how to use HTMX and Django with the DaisyUI component framework. DaisyUI is a framework that builds on TailwindCSS and provides these very nice pre-built components that you can very easily drop into your code and start using to rapidly build applications. And in this video we're going to build this very simple to-do list page that allows us to add to-dos to a list, and it allows us to mark some of those to-dos as being completed and even to delete those to-dos from the list entirely, and this is all using HTMX. Now I provided some starter code. You can see a link to GitHub in the description of the video. Just clone that and run pip install requirements.txt and let's dive in. So let's start by looking quickly at DaisyUI. As you can see, it's the most popular component library for Tailwind. And this adds component class names to Tailwind so you can make these beautiful websites even faster than you can with Tailwind. And we're going to see an example of that if we click through to the components. And we have many available here. What I'm going to click on is the button component, which is one of the most simple ones. And you can see that the HTML to define a button, we can just give it a class of button and it's going to apply the default styles for that button. And you can see we can also put some colors into the HTML as well using classes like button neutral and button primary. So that's quite similar to Bootstrap. If we compare that with the native Tailwind example, so I'm on the buttons page for Tailwind. If we scroll down here, to get this blue button here, we have a button element and you can see the classes that are attached to that. There's many more classes there. Now that's more customizable, but sometimes you want the pre-built components and you can override whatever you need to in those pre-built components. But it gives you some sensible default classes and you can use these, and it's much more simple than having to define all of the classes here. So that's one of the benefits of using a component framework like DaisyUI. You get some good defaults out of the box with some very simple classes. We'll see more about that later when we bring it into the project, but what I'm going to do now for this to-do app is open VS Code. We have a Django application with a single root called index that's protected by the login required decorator. We're going to start by building a model for a to-do in this application. Now in the default starter code we have a user model that inherits from abstract user, so we've defined our own user model. Let's now define a to-do model that will inherit from Django's model class. Now we want the to-do to have a description, which is going to be a model.char field, and we can give that a max length, let's say of 200, and that's going to describe the to-do. And we're also going to add a boolean field called isCompleted to the model, so that's going to be a model.boolean field, and we're going to default that to false. So when a user creates a to-do, we're going to default the value here to false for that field. And we want each to-do list to be specific to a user, so we're going to need a foreign key to the user model. So we're going to define a models.foreign key, and that's going to be to that user model. When we delete a user, we're going to cascade that delete using the models.cascade argument here to the foreign key. And that means that when the user is deleted, all of the to-dos that belong to that user are also going to be deleted from the database. And I'm going to add one last field here called created at, which is going to be a date time field, and I'm going to pass the auto now add equals true keyword argument to that field. And what that's going to do is basically set the created time automatically when the record is created in the database. The final thing to do is a dunder string method that's going to return, let's just say, the description of this to do, so self.description. So that's our to-do model. It's linked to the user model, which is what we need in this application. Let's now bring up the terminal where we have a virtual environment active, and we're going to run python manage.py make migrations. Once we've created that migration file, we can run the migrate command. That's going to create the database, and that's a SQL-like database in the local directory. Now once we've done that, I'm going to copy the name of this model and we're going to move over to views.py. At the top here, from core.models, I'm going to import that model. So we've imported the to-do model, let's copy that, and we're going to define a key in the context called to-dos. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to call todo.objects.filter, and we need to filter all of the to-dos in the database because we only want to get the ones that are attached to the user who is authenticated in this application. So we're filtering that list in order to get the logged in user's to-do list. We can now save the views.py file, and this particular view loads an index.html template. Let's go to the templates directory and we're going to load that template up here, and we're going to edit what's in the template. Currently we only have an h1 tag, What I'm going to do just below that is I'm going to paste in a table, an HTML table, and we're going to have a look at this table. It contains 3 columns, one for the description of the to-do, the second one is the time at which it was created, and the third one is the completed column. So that's the table header that defines the columns. Below that we have the table body, and notice the ID here, to-do table body. We're going to use that with HTMX later. What we're doing in the body is we're looping over all of these to-dos that we added to the context here. So we're looping over all of those and we're rendering out the description, the created and is completed fields into that table as TD elements. So let's save this file, and I'm going to start the Django server, and we're going to go to this page and we're going to see how that looks like. So it started a server on localhost 8000. If we go to the browser here, you can see we get redirected to a login page, and that's because we have the login required decorator on this view. So we're redirected to the login page, and what I'm going to do is actually sign up. And I should note that in the starter code we have Django all-auth installed. So we're using these default all-auth pages. They don't look very good, but they're going to do for this application. So I'm signing up with a user of John Doe. We're going to sign up and we are then logged in and we have this page, but you can see this doesn't look particularly good at the moment. Our table has no rows because we have no to-dos in the database, and there are no real styles on this page at all. We're going to add DaisyUI and Tailwind for that in a little bit later in the video. So what I'm going to do now is create a super user in this application with the create super user command, and we'll call that admin. And what I'm going to do is go to the Django admin, and I'm going to create some to-dos that are attached to the user that I have just created via the registration form. So I've added these to-dos to the application. We have learn JavaScript and learn Python. And if we go back to the page displaying these in a table, before we had no rows. When we refresh the page, we can see these items are appearing in the list. Now what we're going to do now is add TailwindCSS and DaisyUI to the project. So I have this page open here. I'll leave a link to this in the video description. We can get the CDN link to DaisyUI, and of course you can also install that using npm if you have something like Webpack or Vite set up. But what we're going to do, just for simplicity, is we're going to copy the link to the DaisyUI CSS file, and we're going to paste that into our project's base.html. So let's do that at the top. That's within the head tag, we'll paste that CDN link. Now if we go back to the documentation, you can see we also have a link to the TailwindCSS CDN, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to load the Tailwind page because I'm going to show something specific. So we have the page here with the CDN link to Tailwind, but we're not just going to load this script tag here. What we're going to do is scroll down to section 4, and we're going to try and use a plugin with Tailwind CSS. So let me copy this script tag here, and I'm going to paste that just below DaisyUI in the head tag here. So we have the script now in this base.html template. If we look at the URL here, we have the CDN link to Tailwind, and that will load the core library, but we also have some plugins that have been specified here. And the one that we are interested in is the typography plugin. So I'm going to remove the other ones and we can just keep the typography plugin here. Once we've done that, we can save the file. And what I'm going to do is go back to index.html here and scroll to the top. Now to test that Tailwind is working as well as the typography plugin, what I'm going to do is define a div here, and we're going to use the flexbox capabilities in Tailwind CSS. So we'll give that a class of flex, and the items that are going to fall within this div, let me create these here, we'll get the indentation correct, sorry. The items that are going to fall within this div, we are going to do that top to bottom. So we're going to set the flex direction to flex column. And we can also specify the items center class as well. And what that's going to do, when we have the column direction, the cross axis is going to be the row, so along the x-axis, and item center is going to center all of the items on that axis. And finally, let's also add some margins. I'm going to add margin of 10 on the x-axis, but when we have screens that are slightly bigger, so from medium size upwards, we're going to add margin x of 20. So that's our div here. And within that we have the HTML. I'm going to add a couple of classes to the h1 tag as well that are coming from the Tailwind typography plugin. So the one I'm going to use is pros 2x large, and we'll also give the header one some margin bottom here as well with the MB4 class. Now in order to test that this is working, I'm going to save this file and we're going to go back to the application, and I'm going to refresh this page, and we now see we get some different styles. Everything is centered along the x-axis, and our header has some different styles being added now, as well as some margin bottom. So the way we're going to structure this page soon is we're going to have, just under the header, a form that's going to allow the user to submit a new to-do to the server using HTMX. And then below that we'll have a table that contains all of the existing to-dos as well as some actions such as marking a to-do as complete and also deleting a to-do. Now to start with, let's make this table look a little bit nicer using DaisyUI. So I'm going to go back to the DaisyUI documentation, and there's a page for the table component. And you can create different types of tables using the classes that are specified here. We have a base class of table, but you can also specify things like table zebra and some different sizes for the table as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the table zebra class, and let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to add these to the table element. So let's specify the table base class and then table zebra, and we also want this table to be a large table, so we're going to add the table large class as well. So let's save this and go back to the page, and let's refresh the page, and we can now see that the table is looking quite a bit better. We have table zebra as one of the classes, so one row is white and then the next row has that greyish background colour, and that's going to repeat as you go down the table for however many rows you have. So that's our table. It lists out the to-dos. We'll extend this later on with a new column that allows us to mark a to-do as completed and also to remove a to-do from the table, all using HTMX. Let's now move on and create a form above this table that's going to allow us to submit a new to-do to the server. What I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to the forms.py file, and I'm going to create a new form here called to-do form. That's going to inherit from Django's model form class, so let's make sure we inherit from that. Within the model form, we'll define the meta class, which is going to link this form to a model in the application, and that's the to-do model. And we need to import that at the top of the file, and then we can specify the fields that we want to show up in this Django form. We want the to-do's description field to be there, and we also want the is completed field to be in the form as well. So we've specified two fields, and we can now save this file. I'm going to copy the name of the file, and we're going to import that at the top here. So from core.forms, we're going to import the to-do form. And in order to render that form in our template, we need to add it to the context. So I'm going to add a key of form here, and we can just instantiate that to-do form and pass it through to the template. So we now have access to the form in the index.html file. So let's go to that file and we can render the form. We're going to do that at the top of the page. So just underneath this h1 tag, we're going to create a form element. So let's do that just now, and we're going to give the form a class of MB4, so some margin below the form, and we can close that element off. And then what we need to do within the form is we are, to start with, going to render the form with paragraph tags using the form.asp property. And then finally we can create a button that's going to allow us to submit the form. So let's give it a type of submit, and we're going to give that button some classes from DaisyUI. So it's the button class. We're also going to give it the button primary class, and to give some margin above the button, so between the fields of the form and the button, we're going to give the margin top 2, and that button can just say submit here. So let's save this, and we're going to go back to the page, and this is not going to look particularly good, but we are going to improve the styling in this video now. So in order to improve the styling, we're going to use django-widget-tweaks, which should be installed if you copied the starter code. It's part of the requirements.txt file, but if you need to install it, you can run the pip install django-widget-tweaks command. And what django-widget-tweaks is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to look at the form fields that we have and dynamically add classes to those within the Django template. So let's go over to the widget-tweaks documentation, and I'm going to follow these instructions. First of all, we're going to add widget-tweaks to the Django installed apps setting. Let's go to settings.py, and in the installed apps list here at the bottom, I'm going to add the widget-tweaks module. Once we've done that, we can go back to the documentation, and in order to use this in a Django template, we need to load the widget-tweaks template tags at the top of the template. So let's copy that, and we're going to go back to the index.html file and load those template tags at the top. So now we can use the widget-tweaks render field template tag that you see here. So what I'm going to do is define some code just below here in the form. We're not going to render the entire form with form.asp. What we're going to do instead is we're going to render each field individually and add some classes to that. So let's create the container around the field. That's going to be a div with the class of form control, and we can close that off, and then within the actual field itself we'll create a label tag, and for the first field that's going to be for the task description, so we're going to give it a label of task description, and below that we're going to use the render field template tag from django-widget-tweaks, and the field that we want to render from our form, first of all we're going to render the description field, and we're going to add some classes to that. Let's go back to the DaisyUI documentation. There is a page on text inputs, and we are going to use some of these classes here. Now we've already used form control for the container around the form, or rather the container around the field. We're now going to use the input and input bordered classes. So let me copy those, and we're going to define the input class and also the input bordered class. Let's now save that and go back to the page, and we can see how that looks now. We have a bit of a nicer input here for the text, and we can enter our to-do text into that. We also need the is completed field in this form, so we're going to add, or rather we're going to copy this code for the form control and we're going to paste it below. And I'm going to change the label from task description to the question, is it completed? And below that we have the render field. We're going to change the form field here from description to the is completed field. And the final thing we need to do is we need to change the classes that are being used to render that. Now because this is a Boolean field, we're going to go back to the DaisyUI documentation, and I'm going to search for a checkbox. And we get this page here containing some styles for a checkbox. So I'm going to copy that, and we're going to go back to the template, and I'm going to paste that in, and we're going to use the color of success, which is going to be kind of like a green color here. So we're adding these to the form field. Let's save this again and go back to the page and see how this changes the form. You can see we now have this is completed checkbox here, and when we check that we get the background color that's kind of like a green color, and that's the success color in this DaisyUI theme. Now at this stage we're going to add HTMX into the project, and we're going to submit this form to the backend server and then add the to-do to the database. So let's start by going to the HTMX documentation. I'll leave a link to this below the video, and we have a page here for installing HTMX, and we can copy the CDN link and paste that into the base.html file. We'll paste that below the other two, and just for a note here, don't do this in production. Don't import in the entirety of Tailwind and DaisyUI and HTMX through a CDN. This is just for demonstration purposes. Once we've got HTMX installed, what we can do is go back to the index.html file. And remember, the goal here is that when we submit this form, we want to send the data to the backend using HTMX. So what I'm going to do is create an HX post request, and we're going to send that request to a URL called submit to do. So we'll create a URL here called submit to do, and we're using Django's URL template tag here and referencing this URL. We're going to create that in a second, and we're also going to specify an HX target attribute as well. So HX target, and we're going to set that equal to this table body ID here. So let's copy this ID, the target of our response from the HTMX request. We want to swap that into the table body. So we're going to copy that ID, and we're going to reference that ID here in the HX target attribute. So that's our basic HTMX request. We're going to add to that in a second, but what we need to do now is create the URL for this request. So let's copy that and go to urls.py. I'm going to copy this path down below, and we're going to put the correct name in here for this new path. So the path itself, we'll just say it's submit to do, and we're going to create a new view function here called submit to do that's going to handle that HTMX request. So let's copy that and save the urls.py file. We're going to go to views.py, and let's now define another view that's going to be protected with the login required decorator. So it's submit to do, and it's going to take the request as an argument. Now this submit to do endpoint should only take a post request. So let's go to the top, and I'm going to import the require post decorator from Django's decorators.http module, and then we can also decorate the function with require post. So this is the view function. We now need to write the body of this function. What we're going to do is create a variable called form, and we're going to instantiate the to-do form with the request.post data. So the data that's sent in the post request will be passed into the form, and that's going to populate the form. We can then check if the form is valid using the form.isValid function in Django, and if that turns out to be valid, because it's a model form, we can create the to-do object by calling form.save. And we're going to pass the commit equals false flag into this form.save call. So that's going to create the to-do object. That's the Python class, or the instance of that class, but it's not going to save it to the database. In order to save it, we need to attach the foreign key, which is the user. So we're going to set todo.user equal to the request.user, and we know that the request.user is going to be an authenticated user because we're using the login required decorator. Once we've done that and attached the user, we can then call todo.save, and that's going to save that to the database. And then what we are going to do is return an HTML partial that HTMX is going to swap into the DOM. Now if we look at the structure of the HTMX request, we're sending the post request to that URL, and then the hypermedia response is going to be swapped into the to-do table body, and that's that table body element that we see here. Now what we have within there are multiple table rows, one for each to-do that's in the database for that user. What we want to do is we want to get a response back that is another table row, and we want to swap that in at the end of the existing table. So after all of the existing table rows, we want to swap in the new one that we're going to get back from that HTMX response. So what I want to do here is I want to create a partial that contains the data in the table row, and we want to return that from this view function after we've created the to-do, return the row that contains the data for that to-do. Now what I'm going to do is use django-template-partials in order to do this. This is a library, and I've made a previous video on this package. This allows you to create partials dynamically in your code and reference and use those partials in your templates and also in your views in Django. So let's copy the pip install command. I'll leave a link to this documentation below the video, and I'm going to stop the server at the bottom here, and we're going to install django-template-partials into the Python virtual environment. Once we've installed that, let's minimize the terminal, and we're going to go to the documentation, and we need to add template partials into the settings.installed apps. So let's go back to installed apps here, and after django-widget-tweaks we can add template partials. Now what we're going to do once we have it installed is go back to index.html, and we're going to scroll to the top, and we're going to load the template tags from django-template-partials. We can do that with the load partials statement here. And then if we go back to the documentation just to remind ourselves how to actually define these partials, we can do it using the partial def tag. And this syntax here defines the partial called test partial with this content here, and then we can reference that in our Django template anywhere we want, and we do that with the partial template tag here. But there is another one that we can use, and we can actually do this inline with the partial definition template tag. If you want to do it inline, you can pass inline equals true in here. That's exactly what we're going to do now. So let's copy the partial definition and go back to index.html. Now what we want to do is go down to the table body, and it's within this for loop here that we define these table rows. What I'm going to do is paste in that code that I've copied here, and then if we tab everything over, what I'm going to do is end that partial definition with the end partial def statement. Now I'm going to rename this, and instead of calling it inline partial, let's call this to do item partial instead, and we are passing inline equals true. So we've given the partial a name of to do item partial, and we're going to reference that now within the views.py file. So we're going to return the HTML partial, and we want to populate that with the data that we need for this to do here. So what we need to do is when we create the to do here, we need to actually add it to the context first of all. So let's create a context dictionary in this view, and we need to name the key to do, and we're going to reference that new to do that's been created in the database. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to return the render function. We pass the request into that as always, and the template that we want to return is index.html, but we want to reference the partial. We can do that by using the hash symbol and then pasting in the name of the partial here, as you can see. And the final thing to do there is also add the context into the render call, and that will add that to do and make it available for that partial. So we're nearly done with the submit to do form. What we can then do is we are sending a post request here using the hx post attribute. Here it is here, hx post. Now the post request is an unsafe method, and Django's expecting the CSRF token to be present in the headers if we send a post request via an AJAX call. So what we're going to do is go to the Django HTMX documentation, and there's a handy tip that I always use when sending post requests with HTMX. To make HTMX pass the CSRF token, we can copy this into the body tag. So let's copy that and go back to the base.html, and we're going to replace the existing body tag with this one that contains the hx headers attribute pointing at the Django CSRF token. So we can save that, and what I'm going to do is now start the Django development server, and we're going to go back to the page. So we're back here on John Doe's to-do list. Let's add a new to-do here and we'll say learn PHP, and we're going to say that that is completed and then submit that to the server. We get back the table row, and that's the partial that we wanted to get back, but it's replacing the entire existing table instead of appending that new row at the end of the table. So we're going to change the swap method in order to fix that. And as well as fixing the swap method, we're also going to clear out this form when we get a response from Django. So let's see how to do that now if we go back to VS Code. So we're in the base.html file. Let's go to index.html and add a couple of new attributes to the form element. First of all, the swap method, we need to change that, and we're going to add a swap method of before end. Let's go to the documentation for HX swap, and here are the different attributes, or rather the different values for that attribute, and the before end value will insert the response after the last child of the target element. And that's exactly what we want. If we go back to the page, the target is this table body, and that contains a bunch of table rows as its children, and if we want to swap the new row at the end of that, that's exactly what we are going to do now that we've specified before end as the swap technique. And what we also want to do is add an HX on attribute, and we're going to add, or rather we're going to listen to the HTMX after request event. So after the request has been fulfilled, we are going to call this.reset. So let me explain what this is doing. The keyword this in this context will refer to the element where this attribute is defined, so it's going to refer to this form element, and forms, they have a method called reset that's going to clear out the data in all of the fields within that form. So what happens then is when we get the response to our HTMX request, this is going to remove all of the values from the form. Let's now test this out by saving the file and going back to the page, and if I refresh this page, what we're going to do is fill in a new task description. Let's say learn Go is the description, and we're going to submit that. And you can see now that we get back the new row at the end of the existing table. And as well as that, we can see that the form has been cleared out after submitting that request. So the form that allows us to submit the to-do is now working, and the response is being correctly swapped into the DOM. What we're now going to do is add a button here that's going to allow us to mark a to-do as completed. Now I'm going to do this quite primitively. We're not going to focus too much on creating the perfect user interface. What I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to scroll down to the table that we have here, and I'm going to create a new table header, and we're going to call this the actions column. So we have a new column within this table. If we go down to the table row definition here, we now need to add a new table data element to that row. So I've copied that TD element. I'm going to remove the code that's in there at the moment, and we're going to show a button that allows us to mark a to-do as completed, but we only want to do that if the to-do is not already completed. So here I'm going to check if not to-do.is completed, so basically checking that the to-do is not already complete. And we can add the end if statement just below that. And if the to-do is not completed, then we are going to add a button here, and we're going to use those DaisyUI button classes. So button, and I'm going to add button XS, so it's going to be quite a small button. And also let's add the color here with button success. Now the text within the button, let's just say mark complete, and we can then close off that element. Now I'm actually going to add another button to this TD element, and that's going to allow us to delete a to-do as well. So let's create a new button here, and again it's going to have the button and button extra small classes, but we're going to change the color here. If we're deleting that, we're going to give it the color that matches the button error class, and the text here can just say delete. So we have a new column with two buttons. Let's see how that looks on the UI. If we go back to the page and refresh this page, you can see that we now have this new column here, and it doesn't look amazing, but it's not too bad either. We are using the default styles for those components in DaisyUI, but of course you are free to customize those if you want. Now let's start with the mark complete button. When we click this, we want to update the database for that to do and mark that particular to do as being completed. We're going to do that with HTMX by going back to this template, and we're going to focus on this button here and add the HTMX attributes. So we're going to send a post request, and let's create a new URL here, and we'll call this URL complete to do. Now as well as the URL, we need to actually tell Django what is the particular to do that we want to complete. So I'm going to add the to do's primary key into that URL. We can pass a parameter when using the URL template tag by just adding the value after the name of the URL. So we're going to create this URL now. Let's copy the name of it and go to urls.py, and I'm going to copy this one down and just replace the name and also the URL path here. And finally, let's replace the name of this view with complete to do. So we're going to create this new view within the Django views.py file. Let's copy this boilerplate that we have at the top here, and we can paste that down. Again, this is going to be for logged in users only, and it's also only going to accept the post request. We need to change the name of the function, and we also need to accept that parameter that we're passing into the URL. So we need the to-do's primary key, and we actually need to create that within urls.py. I forgot to do that. So we have the URL path here, but as well as complete to do, I'm also going to pass in here the integer primary key for that particular to-do that we want to complete. So the URL will have that dynamic primary key available. Let's go back to the view function, and we're going to write the logic for this view now. We need to fetch a to-do by its primary key. And to do that, I'm going to go to the top, and from Django.shortcuts, let's import getObject or 404, and we're going to copy that, and I'm going to call that function down here, and we're going to create the to-do object by calling getObject or 404. The model is to do, and we need to pass the lookup parameters here. So the lookup parameters are not only going to be the primary key. Yes, we want to fetch the to-do by the primary key in the URL, but we don't want to let users change the to-dos for other users. So we're also going to add another lookup here, and that's the user lookup. We're going to make the user equal to request.user. So the getObject or 404 function, it's going to look for to-dos where the primary key is equal to the primary key that we're getting from the URL. But it's also going to do that second check to make sure that the user who's requesting this particular to-do is the actual user that owns the to-do. So this function will return the to-do object if it exists for that user. We can then mark the to-do as being completed with this line of code here, and then we can call todo.save. So that's going to save it to the database, and it's going to set that is completed field to true. What do we then return? We want to return exactly the same thing that we returned before. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it into this function and fix the indentation. So we've updated this to do here, and we're passing it into the context here, and we're returning that same partial containing the table row. And that's going to return this table row that you see here within the partial def, and it's going to swap that into the DOM. So let's try and see if that is working now. If we refresh this page, let's focus on the first row that says Learn Python. Let's mark that as completed, and we're getting this very strange looking UI here, and that's because we haven't added all of the attributes that we need to this button. So we've only told the button that we want to send a post request here, but that by default is going to take the returned content and swap it into this button itself. We need to set a target here basically. So let's add these attributes to the button. Now what we want to actually replace when we get that response is the existing table row. So we have a table row that represents the to-do. We send the request to mark it as completed, and we want the returned table row to replace the existing row. Now in order to replace the existing row, we're going to set the target here, and we're going to set it equal to the closest table row. So this closest TR is going to start at the button, and it's going to look up the document till it finds a table row, and it's going to make that the target for this HTMX response. What we are also going to do is we're going to completely replace that table row by setting hx swap equal to outer HTML. So once we've added those, let's go back to the page, and we're going to refresh this page. And let's mark Learn JavaScript as completed. And when we do that, we're getting back the correct response now. And the existing row has been replaced with the new row. So if I was to do that again with Learn Go at the bottom, notice that completed is false at the moment, but when we get back the new data, that's set to true. And we're nearly at the end of this video. We're now going to work on the delete button. So when we click delete, obviously we want to remove that row from the document and delete that to do from the database. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to look at this button here. That's the button for deleting the to-do. And again, we're going to add some HTMX attributes. Let's add an hx delete attribute. So this is going to send an HTTP delete request. And we're going to set that again using Django's URL template tag. And the URL, let's say delete to-do. And again, we need to pass the to-do's primary key into the URL so that we know which to-do we're actually deleting from the database. Now when we delete the to-do, we don't actually want to send back any content. We just want to remove that to-do from the table that we have in the front end. We don't want to replace it with anything, we just want to remove it. So we're going to see the logic for that in a second, but what I'm going to do now is create this URL in the application. So let's go to urls.py and we're going to copy the one above down to the line below, and we're going to update the name to delete to do, and also we're going to update the path as well to delete to do. And finally, let's also update the view function. We're going to call the view delete to do, and let's go to views.py and we're going to define that view below. So this one, again, it's login required, and we want to limit this one to only a delete request. So let's go to the top, and as well as require post, we also have another module or another function called require HTTP methods. We're going to copy that and go back down to the bottom here, and we're going to use that here and pass all of the valid HTTP methods that we want to allow this view to accept. And we only want it to accept a delete request, so we're just going to pass delete in. Let's now write the function. I'm going to be lazy here and copy this code at the top, and that's because the logic is going to be very similar. We're going to rename the function to delete to do, and what we're doing again is we take the primary key for the to do and we call get object or 404, and we're looking that up to make sure that we have a to do with that primary key and also that it belongs to the authenticated user. And once we find that to do, we can simply call todo.delete to remove that from the database. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a response, and I'm going to call the HTTP response function in Django and pass a status of 204. And the 204 status code, if we go to Mozilla's documentation, this represents no content, and it indicates that a request has succeeded but that the client doesn't need to do anything with the response. So HTMX is not going to do anything with this response. What we're going to do though is we're going to trigger a client-side event on HTMX. We can do that by adding a header here, and the header that we need to add is called hxTrigger. And the value for this header is the name of the event that we want to trigger. Let's call the event name delete to do. And finally, let's return the response that we have here. So the only other thing I need to do is import the HTTP response object from django.http. So let's do that at the top. From django.http, import the HTTP response, and then we return that, and we're returning it with a particular status code of 204, and we're going to trigger this client-side event called delete to do. And that client-side event, we are only triggering that if the object has been deleted successfully. So when the client gets this response with the hxTrigger header, it knows that the to-do has been successfully deleted from the database, and it can then go ahead and remove whatever to-do is involved in that request from this table. So again, let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to add the logic to listen for this particular event and then respond to that event client side. So in the index.html file, below the hxDelete attribute, let's add another hxOn attribute, and then we'll use a colon, and the name of the event that we're listening for is the delete to do event that we're sending from the server. And then when we get that event, what we want to do is remove the closest table row from the document. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this.closest, and we pass a selector in there, which is the table row selector. And remember, this refers to the button, and the closest function is going to look up the document tree until it finds whatever element is specified. Once we find that table row, we can then delete it from the DOM using the .remove function, and that's then going to remove that from the document. So let's now save this, and we're going to test this out and see if it's working. If we go back to our page here and refresh this page, let's say that we want to delete the learn PHP row from our to-do list. Let's click the delete button, and you can see that that has been removed. And if we refresh this page again, you can see that it's no longer appearing when we refresh. So it has been deleted from the database on the back end, and this button is now working successfully. And with that, we have a fully functional form here that allows us to add things using HTMX, and that form allows us to mark certain elements as completed or not completed. And if we have things that are not completed, then we can mark them as completed, or we can just delete objects entirely from the table. And this is all done with HTMX. It's all done dynamically using AJAX requests that are done under the hood based on the HTMX attributes that we add to the elements in the document. And this is very easy to use, and of course, as we've demonstrated in this video, it's very easy to pair all of that with TailwindCSS and also with DaisyUI components in order to build a nice interactive user interface. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying this content, please consider buying the channel a coffee as well. There's a link in the description, and we'll see you in the next video.